My wisdom is not as much as someone my age 20 years ago because wisdom ages more rapidly now. To be a senior leader, you've got to act like an introvert at times and an extrovert other times to be effective. If you act like an extrovert as an introvert, it's exhausting, and you take introvert breaks to recharge. The same way I take extrovert breaks to recharge when I've been introverted for a while. For hundreds of years in Canada, in the US, white men have been lecturing Indigenous people how to live. So I'm saying, let's turn the tables. What do they have to teach us? We're looking for leadership now in a broader thing. We're looking at women, we're looking at introverts, we're looking at people of color in a way that we would largely ignore them in the past. So it seems to be a human principle. Don't just think about yourself. Get over your ego.
Welcome to the Generation Hustle Podcast, a show that explores the world of business, entrepreneurship, and culture, all centered around the millennial. I'm your co-host Sheriston, alongside my good friend Amin, and this week we have a very special guest. Episode 52 is with professor, author, keynote speaker, and columnist Karl Moore. Professor Moore is an award-winning teacher, researcher, and an internationally recognized leader in the study of introvert, ambivert, and extroverted leaders. He has interviewed over 1,000 CEOs, premiers, cabinet ministers, and even prime ministers. He holds an MBA from USC, a master's from Oxford University, and a PhD from Schulich School of Business. He's currently an associate professor at McGill University and a columnist for Forbes Magazine and the Globe and Mail, and the host of the CEO series on Bell Media. We speak to Professor Moore about his research on introverted, extroverted, and ambiverted leaders, and how different generations have adopted these skills. He explains the consequences of intergenerational mixing in the workplace and how boomers, millennials, and Gen Z can successfully coexist. He also details his work on Indigenous communities and how we can use current events and education to foster these relationships. This was such an inspirational and insightful conversation that we learned so much from. So without further ado, Professor Karl Moore.
Okay, awesome. So thank you, Professor Moore, for joining us today. We have a lot of topics to, discuss. Before we get into, all of our questions, why don't we get a little background on yourself and kind of your areas of research and, what you teach at McGill?
So I grew up in Toronto, went to school, USC and Harvard, then came back and worked for IBM for 11 years in sales and management. Did my PhD in Toronto, then taught in England at Oxford for 5 years and came to McGill about 20 years ago. What I've been focusing on these days is CEO leadership, and a book's coming out of that, Introverts, Ambiverts, and Extroverts. The title is We're All Ambiverts Now.
Right.
I also have a book with my publisher now called Okay Boomers, and it's focusing on how to work with Generation Z and Millennials more effectively. Mm-hmm. So those are two things that I'm in the midst of doing research right now on. And so I worked for a while and then been teaching and writing books for a while. I've got 10 books and about 30 what we call referee journal articles. So I've written a lot over the years. But that's what my job is. So
That's awesome. So I guess let's get right into this. So, a topic that you just mentioned that you've been researching on is the evolution of personalities as it relates to leadership. So one of the concepts you bring up is a term called an ambivert, and how it's a cross between both an introvert and an extrovert. So could you help us detail first what an ambivert is and kind of describe how this style can lead to success in a leadership role?
Well, an ambivert is someone who can act like an introvert at times and an extrovert at other times. So the title of my book is We're All Ambiverts Now, arguing based on about 450 interviews of senior executives that to be a senior leader, you've got to act like an introvert at times and an extrovert at other times to be effective. Now, when I first heard about this term, I was excited. I had a new toy. In about 20 interviews in a row, I mentioned ambivert, and every executive said, I'm an ambivert.
Okay.
And I think what it is probably about 40, it's a bell curve.
Right.
And about 40% of people are introverts, 40% of people are extroverts, and about 20% of people are genuinely ambiverts. So when you think about the need for an executive to act like an ambivert, so I'm an extrovert, but CEOs tell me when they go to a meeting where they're discussing strategy, if they open up what they're thinking about, one is they already know what they're thinking about. I want to know what you guys are thinking about. But if I say my thoughts, everybody goes, oh, that's why you're CEO. I love it. And all conversation comes to a stop.
Right.
Or if I come in and say, hey, Sheriston, what do you think? And you say something and then we go around the room. One, I'm learning as CEO. And at the end, Happy thought. I'm the CEO. I get to decide.
Right.
But my ideas have evolved through the conversation. So this is one of the great strengths of an introvert. So as an extrovert, I've got to learn to shut up and listen more.
Mm-hmm.
Now, an introvert sometimes has got to act like an extrovert. They go to a meeting, they've got to work the room. They've got to schmooze and have dinner with big clients because that's central to bring business in. So Claude Mageau was the CEO of CN, one of the big railroads in the world, about 25,000 people at the time. He was COO. They're going to make him CEO. They gave him a coach, and the coach said, here's a clicker like someone in a bar might have, a bouncer. 5 times a day, click, got to act like an extrovert. For example, get in the elevator in the morning, and instead of ignoring everyone and licking your feet and saving us hundreds of thousands of dollars on the elevator ride, go, good morning, Susan, and say something you're not going to argue with, like it's a warm day or it's not, like, something no one's going to argue with a great one about. And then say, Susan, you killed it last week in your presentation of the board. I'm so delighted by the work you do. Get off the elevator. See, if the CEO ignores you, doesn't know your name, you go, my career's in trouble. I'm sending my resume to CP. They're a great competitor in Calgary. That's an overreaction, but we're human beings. When I first heard about Ambiverts, I'm jealous. These people just sound like better human beings than me as an extreme extrovert. So I'm a bit ticked off. And I looked for what are the weaknesses of ambiverts, but there hasn't been much research on it. Adam Grant at Wharton did a study about 10 years ago, and that's about it for the last 40 or 50 years. It's a term that really disappeared from literature. What I recognize from talking to a bunch is that they don't have the strengths to the same degree as an introvert or extrovert. They can do a bit of introvert, a bit of extrovert strengths, but not to the same degree. They're also, and this is their biggest weakness, are confusing to people. Sometimes you're like, yeah, sometimes you're like that. That's the only time I use that voice, but it seems to get it where I just can't figure you out.
Right.
Because on the other hand, I'm very much an expert. I took students to Tokyo, Bangkok, and Hong Kong about a year and a half ago before the pandemic. And I was in the lobby of the hotel in Tokyo by myself. A number of the students, one by one, came over and go, Karl, are you all right? Because they would expect me as an extrovert to be with them. And if I wasn't, and I'm by myself doing the introvert thing, they assumed I was not well. So it's something where I'm more predictable, and ambiverts are confusing to people.
Just a thought on that. So the development of that personality trait, is that something that's constantly in fluctuation? So if I think I identify as more of an introvert, but is that something that we can kind of continuously change based on our surroundings, or is that something more inherent? Like, is there something that we're always going to revert back to?
Well, they did some research at Harvard looking at 4-month-old babies and the response to stimulation. Right. So the central idea about if you're an introvert or extrovert is how much stimulation do you like before you tip over? Introverts love people, love being with people. They prefer smaller groups, but because it's less stimulating than a big group, at a certain point they tip over, got to take introvert breaks and recharge.
Right.
Go for a walk, listen to Mozart, whatever. And we also have extrovert breaks. So when I read about it, there was literature on introvert breaks, nothing about extrovert breaks. And I reflect as an extrovert, I sit in my office here at McGill, writing for a couple hours about, ironically, introverts. After a couple hours, I can't take it anymore. Yeah. Do you hear the pain in my voice, guys? Yeah. Like I need stimulation. So I go down one floor where there's an endless supply, or there was pre-COVID-19.
Yeah.
Undergrads are happy to talk to me. And in fact, they often tease me, go extrovert break, but I need to recharge and come back to the energy. So there is about a 40 to 50% hardwiring based on looking at 4-month-old babies and following them for decades. So the response to stimulation suggested more or less introverted or extroverted. But as adults, we grow over time. So when I looked at the literature, it was almost entirely based on psychology professors testing 20-year-olds, undergrads, which they have an endless supply of.
Right.
I'm interested in you guys in your 40s, 50s, and 60s when you're senior leaders. And so there's an evolution over a lifetime. But now I'm looking at a bias sample. They're all senior leaders. So if you go, I hate that stuff, you're not going to be CEO.
Yeah.
So it's something where are people that again and again proven to be excellent leaders, but they'd learn to act like the other because that's what the job required. Now, it's interesting because life requires this as well. I assume you guys don't have kids, but if you have a kid around grade 3 or 4, you lose your name you're now the father of Susan.
Right.
Because in the grade 3 classroom, they're more important than you are. And if you get upset, we go, jerk, grow up.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, you beat your 3-year-old, your grade 3 daughter on every level. You're tall, you make more money, you have more education, you're cooler, except she's cuter. She wins, hands down. But in that context, she's more important. So you step back. Or if you have a spouse, when you go to his or her work, you step back because it's about them, not about you. So there's a certain amount of life maturity of learning to step back and not demand and not suck all the air out of the room because you're an adult now. So you do evolve over time depending on your roles, but there's a certain degree of I am an extrovert. In the senior's home, I'll be popular because I'll go in my wheelchair and visit everyone just because I'm looking for stimulation, I suspect.
Yeah.
Come back to me in 30 years.
Yeah, for sure.
That's awesome. When it comes to leaders, like throughout your research and throughout, your personal experience, what is one thing that they can kind of do today when it comes to their style, which would be more effective in a modern workplace?
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that what we call postmoderns, Generation Z. So my book on Millennials and Z argues in one sentence this: people over 45 with a university degree were taught a modern worldview. People under 35 with a university degree have been taught a postmodern worldview. And postmodern is a rejection of modern values to some degree. So Generation Z are less hierarchical and must be listened to more. So you could act a bit more introverted.
Yeah.
Because if you don't listen to Zs, you're a jerk.
Right.
Now, when I was your age, the older people, we almost literally salute and do what they say. Where one is that your generation goes, no, I have truth, I have insight that you lack. So maybe you're higher up, but we're more equal and you should listen to my ideas. Okay, you can decide because you're the boss, but you got to listen to me. Part of that is in a turbulent world we're in now. My wisdom is not as much as someone my age 20 years ago because wisdom ages more rapidly now. So part of my wisdom is just no longer wise. Therefore, I got to tap into Generation Z and Millennials to be up to date in today's world. The most obvious example is technology. So I interviewed for my Forbes blog a 12-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
And you go, what are you doing talking to? Like, what are you doing? 12-year-old, give us a break. But her dad said, who's the CEO, my daughter has 35,000 followers on TikTok.
Right.
And when I mentioned TikTok, you go, okay, a 12-year-old can teach you stuff.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's an extreme example. But the idea is that I need to be reverse mentored 25% of the time on average by undergrads to be up to date. This was not true when I was their age, so I'm a bit bitter. But it's something where the fact is the world's changing more. I need to tap into young people because they want to be and because it's the right thing to do from a strategic viewpoint.
Yeah, for sure. So that's an interesting point. I think that's something that we've been looking at for quite some time now in terms of just how that shift between the two generations and how we view kind of authority and kind of just anything in the workplace. And so that's kind of what I wanted to ask you. And you brought it up with the pandemic and things like that in terms of how we've kind of switching the way that we work. So as we're kind of going to more a remote kind of environment, more virtual environments, whether that's with work or any other relationships, how do you think this will kind of affect those relationships moving forward? Do you think that's going to be a bit more combative between the generations, or is it going to provide more of an environment to kind of coexist together?
Well, it's interesting because I think a lot of younger people will respond well to working from home.
Right.
Like, they see it more positively. Where some older people, we've seen this at some of the big banks, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, where the CEO is saying, you got to show up to work. That's somewhat old school, the way that he grew up or she grew up and they, how things are done. They're right to some degree. But younger people go, look at, I can't afford to live in Manhattan. I'm spending 2 hours, 3 hours a day commuting. If I don't have to do that a couple days a week, that's golden. So right. I think there's kind of a different view of the older guys go, no, you got to be here. But I remember when I was your age, or maybe a little bit older, I would occasionally put my suit jacket on my chair to leave the impression I'd gone to the bathroom. And I could go for hours because, his jacket's there, therefore he must be here. He's just not here right now because he's at the bathroom or he's going in a meeting or whatever. So I would, I remember one time our boss, we'd all wait till he left.
Yeah.
Right.
And one day he forgot something, so he came back and we're all gathered around the elevator. So he just grins at us. He totally knows what we're doing.
Yeah.
So what we did is we put one of the guys to watch when his car drove off, and then we get in the elevator. So we learned our lesson.
Yeah.
But that kind of thing where I have to see you to believe you're working is just so old school in today's world. It was old school 2 years ago. Now it's beyond grasp, old school.
Yeah.
So I think there's going to be some generational friction there and some back and forth. It's also, I've been reading articles that a fair number of people are thinking of quitting because they've rethought life and so on, and it's a good employment opportunities out there. I don't need to take this nonsense. I'll just go somewhere else because they keep calling me.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to have to change how we do work in order to keep the Zs and the millennials, younger millennials particularly, happier because the new world they live in.
With that being said, this kind of benefits that movement of ambiverts then, because if we're moving towards that kind of world, it seems like the ambiverts are best suited for that kind of transition.
Well, something I think, you got to learn, if you want to be a leader, now you can go, look, I don't want to be a leader. Well, that's fine. Like I'm on a board of a small AI company. We have AI programmers, they love being by themselves, writing code all day.
Right.
And we totally need it. We don't want them out schmoozing the customer over lunch very often. So it's something where that's great if that's your personality. But if you want to climb the ladder and get more senior in leadership, you're going to have some flexibility and learn to do that. But if you act like an extrovert as an introvert, it's exhausting, and you take introvert breaks to recharge. The same way I take extrovert breaks to recharge when I've been introverted for a while. So let me just talk just briefly about extrovert breaks. So there was lots of articles on introvert breaks, zero on extrovert breaks. So I'm ticked off. How come the introverts get all the press? And I wrote a couple articles for the Wharton Leadership Digest because, as I mentioned, I go down and see students. When I go to a restaurant without my wife and kids, I don't sit reading a book. I do read books, but I sit at the bar and talk to total strangers.
Yeah.
Right.
Because it gives me energy and I feel connected. And again, I'm an older guy. I have a wedding band on. I'm a professor. So it's amazing how, I have a wedding band on. I mean, there's older women in the world, but, as I sit down, the first thing I say to the woman beside me is, my wife and kids sadly couldn't make it here to New York. So I'm stuck by myself and just thought it'd be fun to talk to people in New York. I love New York. Like everybody relaxes because mentioning your wife as the first thing you say is just not a good pickup line.
Yeah.
Like they just go, this is the worst approach
Yeah.
of anyone in the world. So they go, oh, this guy actually is married and he loves his wife and he's just chatting. He just likes to chat. And mainly I would ask some questions about life in New York and what they do. And if I ask you about you, everybody relaxes because your favorite subject is you, to a certain degree. So it's something where I take those breaks that recharge me. And that's what I need to do after time by myself. So we have to learn who we are and relax into it, but be flexible in many contexts.
For sure. I love that you brought this up in this example specifically because there's a very growing kind of consensus amongst, I guess, millennials and the next generation that when you're out and maybe you're eating or something, and if you're alone, you kind of you're automatically on your phone or you're automatically connected to something. Yeah. Your first thought isn't to speak to the person beside you. Like that kind of culture is not kind of there anymore. And I feel like it's almost reflective of the kind of extension of tech. As we evolve, I find that we kind of take every real life situation and try to create a tech version of it. So as an example, like to this point, we always have our phone when we're going out to eat. If you want to date someone, it's like, you're not going to go out and meet someone. You're going to probably swipe on your phone and use an app or something like that. Right. So
well, that's probably realistic. Yeah.
Right. So I wanted to get your opinion on that and kind of what you see from this emerging in terms of like the development of our societies, because it kind of seems like your perspective on this is like a rare breed. We don't see that type of people as much anymore. So can you speak to that and kind of where you see this development taking us?
I find if I talk to anyone, including your generation in a bar, a restaurant in a bar, and you're sitting there eating, people love to talk. If you have an audience that's attentive and, good listener and has interesting questions, that I find no problem talking to anybody of your generation, that's fine. On the other hand, I totally agree with you. With my phone, like I can read the Financial Times. I get the Financial Times, New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Globe and Mail. Like I have so much, the Atlantic. I have an infinite store of things to read and see what's happening out there. So I tend to do that. And I ask a lot of, undergraduate students and MBA students about dating. And there's, their vast laughter and amusement. But the fact is, most meet people online now.
Yeah.
So in the old day, you just meet some, girl or whatever, guy, whatever you're interested in a bar, and you go, hey, she's cute. And you chat, and they go, yeah, you're cute and charming. And, you might get her phone number.
Right.
So this is the old school way. But today, you can just meet so many more people online. But still in university, and I remember doing this, but my students still do it today, where you sit down and you say, she's kind of cute. I'll go sit beside her.
Yeah.
So it's college is a great way to meet guys or girls because you just sit beside them. And I remember what I used to do. I would say, you seem to really understand this. And every woman I know at university goes, yeah, I do. And I go, I'm not quite getting it. Can we have coffee and you could help me with it? And you have coffee, and once in a while, a smart one would go, you know this better than I do, and you kind of go, maybe. And they go, is this our first date? And then you go, whoa, but it's something where those techniques in university and college you still do because there's an endless supply of men and women there that are single,
Right.
and it's an age where it's fine. But most of my students, many of them meet online, so just the way the world's gone. But I still think college is a great way to meet people.
Yeah. Yeah.
For sure.
Do you think like the intersection of technology and just like social interaction that we do have as normal people is negative in a sense as well? Because we know it also has a lot of negative effects in terms of, say, public perceptions and how you want to kind of put yourself out there. So how do you kind of see that side of things in terms of putting yourself out there, feeling good, and how it relates back to, like, say, your personality and how it impacts you?
I don't want to be the old guy whining, because it's easy enough to find those people, young people. And, when I tell stories, my friends just roar with laughter at the foolishness of young people. But, what I say to them is generally about a year or two later, you want the same thing. You just kind of, you stop complaining and kind of lean into it. So I think young people are great. And how they react with the world is just the reality of where we're going. On the other hand, there's something about a real conversation with someone is so much better than Zoom. Reading a book is better than just, looking at 4 or 5 things on Google. So I think that you guys will calm down a bit and return a little bit to the past. But by and large, mainly what you're doing is great. And it makes perfectly good sense given the technology we have. And our generation would have done the same thing. So we should get off our high horses and stop complaining so much. Though I think you'll evolve a little bit over time. Like when you have kids, a small child just needs your attention. And if you're on your phone too much of the time, you're a poor parent.
Yeah.
So I think, I see that with a park across from our house where there's lots of moms and dads with small kids. And, you don't want to spend too much time on your phone. It's because your kid needs you.
Yeah.
So I think you'll back off a bit, but the world's just changed fundamentally.
Right.
C'est la vie. And largely, it's a good thing.
For sure. So let's make a little transition here in terms of discussing, strategy and framework. So, as a business student, both of us were business students. We've all heard of the famous Porter's 5 Forces, and how this framework has existed for quite some time now. So, however, you also mentioned a new wave of strategy called emergent strategy. So, which is something your friend Henry Mintzberg has focused on. So, before we get into that, one of the things that's always fascinated me is like how these frameworks actually come to exist in the first place. So, could you help us understand, how strategic frameworks are created and, how some of them, like the Porter's 5 Forces, stand the test of time? Because I believe this was in the 1990s or a little earlier when this was created, but we still in 2020 or 2021, I should say, practice it today.
Well, I co-teach a class with a BCG partner. And so we have our top 30 strategy frameworks we go through. And some are like the Boston Consultant, stars, dogs, cash cows, question marks. And those are classics that are still used today. that have stood the test of time. They're still useful. And at BCG, McKinsey, Bain, those kind of places are still using a 5 forces model, and it works out well. Now, what I encourage students to say, look at, you should add a few strategic frameworks every year. Mm-hmm. And where I send them to is McKinsey, BCG, and Bain. Part of it is they have very clever people, and partly is how they market is they come up with HBR articles and so on, McKinsey quarterly articles, where you read them and go, hey, I want some of this. This person knows what they're talking about. I'm willing as CEO to pay for it. So it's a way of advertising their ideas. And there are places that keep coming up with, new frameworks and thoughts. An interesting sidebar, I did a study with a PhD student at Oxford where we looked at, he'd done PhD work towards psychology and switched to management. Mm-hmm. And we argued that frameworks should between 3 and 4 or 5, like the 4 forces, the 5 forces, things like that, because of human cognition. 2 is not enough. But the 12 months, like it took you years, probably grade 2 or 3 to remember. Like I remember October, what comes after October, I couldn't remember. December, I remember it's Christmas. But it's something where it took you a long time, or the 10 commandments, that's God. Yeah. Right? Like we can't remember 10 things like that but 3 or 4 is good from a cognition viewpoint. So a certain practical that if you have 3 or 4, you're more apt to be memorable, maybe 5 if you're really cool. So it's something where Porter's ideas have simply stood the test of time, and he sold them well. He went out there in big books and the HBR, and he used that whole system to get his ideas out there. So I always look for new ideas, a few a year, and I find McKinsey Quarterly, the Harvard Business Review, BCG, and Bain are great places for ideas because they're idea factories. Mm-hmm. So good place to live. Now, 2 of the biggest names in the world of strategy are Michael Porter and Henry Mintzberg. So Henry is a close friend. We talk hockey. His father had season tickets to the Montreal Canadiens in the 40s. Okay. So he's been going since he was like 4 years old. He's 81. Mm-hmm. So a long time a Canadiens fan. So we talk about stuff like that. So, and then Michael Porter, we gave an honorary doctorate at McGill about 5 years ago. So I interviewed him for an hour for my radio show. So great guys. Now, what would argue is that emergent strategy is more of today's world. So the 5 forces tend to be done by the CEO. You go away for a long weekend to a really nice hotel with the C-suite. You bring in McKinsey, and the great ones come up with an idea and say, the rest of you do this. And we salute and go, oh, that's why you make the big bucks. Where that works in a world which is not changing much. Now, emergent strategy is more Mintzberg's approach at saying, look, ideas bubble up throughout the organization. Yeah. Your boundary spanners, people with 1 foot in the world, the turbulent world, and 1 foot in the organization, like salespeople and so on, are more aware of what's happening in that turbulent world than people at the top, where it's kind of, filtered out from you. So the CEO still makes the final decision of strategy, but what we want is have a culture that encourages innovation, and we're learning all the time as an organization. But the CEO and the senior team get to decide what to scale up and what strategies to take throughout the organization. So instead of thinking of them, they recognize good ones when they come along. So strategy emerges from interacting with a turbulent, changing world as opposed to coming from the top down. Now, I've interviewed like the CEO of Air France. They spend billions of dollars on new planes. That's a CEO decision, because if they get it wrong, we're in deep trouble. Yeah. So some decisions, on the other hand, most, like I talked to the guy who runs Oliver Wyman worldwide, and Scott said that he doesn't say what is the next thing. Our consultants around the world figure out what is the next thing because our clients keep asking for it. Someone builds that capability, hires some young people that know data analytics. Now we have a data analytics practice. So it merges from people on the front line as opposed to from the top down. Mm-hmm. So both approaches are used, depends on the organization. And most CEOs I've talked to say that it's a combination of the two. But we're moving to more of an emergent world than in the past, I would argue. The world's gone nuts to a certain degree.
Yeah. Would you say the tech companies like Google, Facebook and stuff were like maybe early adopters of this kind of strategy? Because I feel like the tech industry specifically, you have a lot of ideas coming in from the bottom up. And then, like you mentioned, the CEOs, C-suite make the decisions. But I think they encourage an environment of open innovation and pooling ideas. So would you say like the tech industry was like an early adopter of like emergent strategy, and that's why they've been so successful?
Well, partly is that, like, as Google, you didn't know what, you never said, let's go Google something
Yeah.
because we're Google. Like, they
Yeah.
learned as they went along and said, well, and they look at data enormously to say who's responding, who likes, they try lots of new products, some die off. And we don't call that failure, we call it learning. So the idea is that let's try a bunch of things. Most will die off, but a few will prove very successful and will change the world. So I think the high tech is one where we don't know because we have no one who's been here 30 years, like no one. So there's no old man or woman we can pull out and say, what do you think? It's something that we're learning as we go along. So it's the nature of the world they're in. But I'm arguing that the world is going in that direction. So we should learn from the Googles and the Facebooks and the LinkedIn of the world.
So what would you what would your best piece of advice be for like, say, future leaders or current leaders on effective strategy implementation? And what are some of the things that you find are core that they should consider when looking at a strategy as a whole?
Well, something where that learning model approach. Now, it's interesting if you're younger and starting out, one of the things you have to learn is how to manage upward and how to reverse mentor. So I told older people that you should be reverse mentored 20-25% of the time. But now at your age, you guys are the ones doing the reverse mentoring. So you got to learn how to mentor your boss with new ideas without ticking her off. So that's kind of the managing upward idea. And in my long career, I've always had a boss. So I've always had, we don't manage downward. We manage people that work for us, but we manage upward. But what you have to understand is, what's the boss trying to accomplish? What does she want? What's her agenda? How is she aligning with the CEO's agenda? Because if I'm working on item 17 for my boss, she doesn't care. I always want to be working on one of the top 3 issues for my boss, because then I'll get time and resources and I'll be a star. So I need to understand where they are. But part of what I got to do today is say, how do I feed innovation up? One is, I want to be the person creating innovation, trying things out, trying experiments. And then how do I get that where it's accepted and to a large degree, make them convinced it's their own idea? If you can do that, you're done. But you don't have to, you can't be too hung up on who's getting credit and wait a minute. It's more of, let's just improve things. That'll be good for the organization and for our customers. And people will start recognizing that I'm valuable over time. But don't make too much fuss about making sure you get all the credit you're due.
I like that you mentioned that, because one of the things that we have a lot of our kind of guests who come on talk about is that kind of relationship between the employer and employee, and how that has kind of switched in, over the generations, how we view each other and kind of how we accept that kind of authority. And so when you look at our generation, as millennials and Gen Z, how do you think we can best be prepared for that workforce where I argue that we don't really have a set strategy to prepare for, right? Like, we're kind of in the midst of all these generations trying to impose their kind of own view, and we're kind of just entering that. So how do you think we can kind of best kind of merge those different generations and also have them kind of work together seamlessly, I guess, if possible?
Well, it's tough to a certain degree. It's the boomers and the Xers that have got to lean into managing you well.
Mm-hmm, right.
So I tend to speak to them them, and they're more apt to be executives. So my speeches are more aligned to them and suggesting how they approach you. But on the other hand, what can you do? Like, you could say, read this article, do stuff like that. But I think it's learning side by side with them and helping educate them about the value your generation can bring if you look after us and you understand where we're coming from. So there's an education process that you've got to do for the older generation. But sometimes, sending them an article or a book to read is a good way of doing that, where someone else is saying it rather than you.
It's hard to kind of establish it. I think like when I'm taking an example of when we go apply for a job, for an example, right? So if I'm going to apply for a role, I'm trying to fit into the company culture. I'm trying to fit into that company mold to an extent, but also I want to bring in kind of like an individual flair to that point, because I think this generation is very focused on that. What can you bring to the table, and what do you provide differently than the others. So I think that's where there's like fine balance where it's kind of adopting a new strategy, but also kind of following a bit of the norm. And that's where this generation is kind of lost in terms of how we do that.
So one of the key things I talk to my students about is organizational culture.
Right.
So partly is saying, if you're a CEO, you got to adjust that culture. But I think at your age, you go, okay, what is the culture of McKinsey, of IBM, of Google, and where do I fit in best? So you need to be flexible and stretch a bit, but you don't want to snap. So what you want to do is kind of suss out what is the organizational culture and where would I feel the most comfortable? Because if you're more like, sometimes I have students say, look, I got job offers from McKinsey, Bain, and BCG. Where should I go? And I go, well, maybe McKinsey is slightly cooler, but they're all great.
Yeah.
Who did you like?
Right.
And they go, oh, I love Bain. I go there. You're more apt to be successful because at the end of the meeting, you high-fived. You just like, this is my natural habitat. So I look for a culture that is one that you feel pretty comfortable with. And if you're really at loggerheads with a culture, you're probably going to be really irritated and you're not going to be able to change them that much. So I think understanding, and you do that by job interviews, but also getting on LinkedIn and looking for alumni from your school that have been a few years and just chatting with them or friends you know and go, honestly, what's it really like? And having those conversations about what do they reward? When are you allowed to go home? Do they make you sit at your desk just to be seen and stuff like that, where you can get a sense of, and partly saying, look, here's who I am. You think I'd fit in?
Yeah.
And it's unfair at your age to go, here's who I am, because you're still learning and growing, but you have some knowledge of who you are.
Right.
And just see if there's a good fit.
So, you bring up a good point in terms of, meeting people and even using LinkedIn as a form of understanding the work environment. So in your experience, what would you say to like young individuals on the power of networking and what it can actually kind of bring you in terms of, say, opportunity, knowledge, and experience? Because personally, I feel like it's brought in and opened up a lot of doors. But based on your personality, it can be kind of sometimes hard to put yourself out there. So what would you say for like the younger generations on the importance of networking?
Well, I think it's really depends on the industry, but overall, I think it's very critical. And I think introverts can be great networkers, but they prefer one-on-one as opposed to schmoozing, working a crowd, going to a cocktail thing, which hopefully we'll be getting to cocktail things soon. But it's something where introverts are more apt to do it one-on-one. But I find that LinkedIn's a great place to reach to alumni for your university, because if you reach out to someone a bit older and say, particularly if you know someone, like if you say, hey, Karl suggests that I chat to you about something, but just reach out and say, look, I'm thinking of iBanking. Could you chat with me 10 or 15 minutes on Zoom to give me a sense of what it's like at Citibank, what it's like at Deutsche Bank, so you can connect with those people. And when you go work at Deutsche Bank, just say to someone, a little more experienced, hey, can I have coffee? I just want to hear about what you guys do in credit analysis. So you kind of work that network, but as an introvert, it'd be having coffee one-on-one as opposed to let's get a group of people and go play poker. So there's kind of a different approach as an introvert, but an extrovert can have coffee as well. But I think networking is a great way of learning, but partly you don't do it just to go, oh, they know me and like me, but I want to have a real conversation. I want to learn from them. And maybe I'll suggest one or two observations I have, reverse man them lightly, just give them an idea because you're smart and you're valuable, but let them be the ones that are doing most of the talking. But, I use the network I have for McGill around the world to help students get jobs, or at least apply for jobs. I use it when I travel. I do McGill events around the world. I just reach out and said, I'm in Istanbul.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do an event. I'll talk about my research, and 25, 30 people show up. So it's something where that is something which I think is a key element of success in today's world, but introverts can do it as well. Just do it quietly and one-on-one as opposed to a bigger group, and asking sincerely for wisdom and advice. Everybody loves.
Yeah, and I kind of just want to understand how you kind of see these different personalities and how we're kind of changing and shifting these attitudes, how it kind of will manifest in society. Like obviously a lot of your research has kind of honed in on these personality traits in the workplace, but how do you think this is going to affect societal movements and how we kind of live as a whole?
Well, it's interesting because traditionally thought leaders are extroverts. And Susan Cain wrote a book called Quiet about 6, 7 years ago. And I've worked with Susan now, got to know her, written with her a bit. So we're moving to a view that introverts can be great leaders as well. So if we rewind the tape to about 15, 20 years ago, leaders were men, white, extroverts. And what I'm arguing today is that actually you want to act like an introvert at times to be an effective leader. We need as men to learn from women, to adjust our approach. So it's not great women's leadership, it's just great leadership. So more empathy, more listening. Well, men can do that too, and we should. And I just started a column for the Globe and Mail called, our national newspaper here in Canada, called Indigenous Leaders. So what we're doing is an Indigenous student and I every 2 weeks interview an Indigenous leader, where for hundreds of years in Canada, in the US, white men have been lecturing Indigenous people how to live. So I'm saying, let's turn the tables. What do they have to teach us?
Mm-hmm.
So it's the idea that we're looking for leadership now in a broader thing. We're looking at women, we're looking at introverts, we're looking at people of color in a way that we would largely ignore them in the past. But those are kind of our emerging models of leadership. They look and sound different than the past. Now, white men like me can still lead, so that's fine, but I'm not worried about that. It's that we're saying, let's look at more variety in terms of how we think of leaders. And that's making our world a different place than it has been in the past.
Yeah, for sure. And I think now more so than ever, and I guess that point is you can argue that at any point in time as different things come up, but obviously in recent weeks, we've kind of seen some of the residential school system's consequences, and they found bodies of children under these schools. And I think we're up to 3 schools now within the last couple of weeks, I want to say. So obviously these are kind of bringing up a lot of those historical ties and historical kind of relations. So as we kind of move into this world where we're focusing more on learning from these different cultures and different perspectives as well. And like you mentioned, we should have these indigenous leaders so that we can learn their perspective. There's still kind of that friction because there was no kind of resolution, or there wasn't any kind of however you want to call it. There's really never going to be any true solution to this. But how do you think we can kind of start tackling this issue? It seems like it's become such a controversial area to even look at, but it needs to be done.
Well, it's a huge area, and it's something about hundreds of years of history, and terrible treatment, and how do you make up for it? How do you apologize? Things like that. It's going to be a long solution. It's going to take years, decades perhaps, but by being concerned, aware of it, and wanting to improve that, and listening to what they need. Now, you can't give them everything they need, but there's something to saying, tell us how we can help. Tell us what you need, and we'll provide the funding at the federal level as a government. That I think is a more humble approach, and one more based on their world as opposed to our world. And I think that's a shift from trying to make them like all other Canadians, was what the government tried to do for many years, for decades, probably even centuries, where recognizing that different parts of society have different values and strengths, and recognizing that as something that's valuable. So I think starting place is humility and spending a lot of time listening rather than lecturing.
Another area of that is kind of what we're seeing a lot of is how it's manifesting on social media. And I think it's kind of created a very combative environment. It's very, there's a lot of echo chambers in how we communicate nowadays. I think a lot of what you're saying in terms of, being out there, connecting, communicating face to face and things like that would solve a lot of these issues. But it just seems like our ease of communication is kind of always skewing towards something that's not, it's something that's counterproductive to what would help us.
Well, I think what Indigenous people say, there's some books to read. We have an article interviewing Bob Joseph, should be out next Monday on National Indigenous Day, about 21 things you should know about the Indian Act. And it's June 21, so just incredible timing in a sense, by pure luck. But it's a matter of reading and thinking and listening is what we need to do to understand their worldview. So I think a lot of, some research, and also going to reserves for, days when they open up, to go there and just see what they're doing and be ready to listen and learn. So I think it's something where, it's a call for Canadians to spend some time over the next number of years learning about the Indigenous world and the values it brings to us, and showing respect and giving room for them to live the lifestyle that is appropriate and helpful for them.
I want to say we're at the beginning of that movement, so to speak, and we're hoping to see kind of where this kind of extends to. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and to kind of bring us together. So hopefully that's kind of the movement that'll go in. But Professor, that kind of wraps up the bulk of the content portion that we like to talk about. One thing that we always like to end on is just get your thoughts on, how you, like, just to get your thoughts on, your own personality and how you view the world. So one thing I want to ask you is, what would you want us to take away from your research? You've done a lot of research into personalities, into societies, into people. What would one thing that you want us to take away, our listeners, our readers, our viewers, whatever it is, from your work and from your research?
Well, I think it's something saying we valued certain things in the past too much, like extroversion. And so now we're kind of going, actually, introverts have great strengths. Indigenous peoples have great strengths. Women have great strengths. So these are things that we should pay more attention to. And in an emergent world, we are less certain of our views. And there's still some truth with a capital T. Some things are still evil. Don't murder.
Right.
These are things that are still true. But a little less certain about some of the things, and a willingness to learn and be taught by others. To me, that strikes me as, just some of the central things I'm thinking about these days.
That's awesome.
For sure.
And maybe as we kind of end this off, what would the best piece of advice you would give to someone in a younger generation, millennial or Gen Z?
I guess love your neighbor.
Be empathetic, love each other, and just be kind.
Yeah, and listen with respect and have the humility that maybe you can change your mind, but still keep some of your values. So it's not as if everything's on the table, but most things are on the table, and be willing to show respect for other people and humility to learn from them. And in one sense, it's just a great spiritual principle, love your neighbor, which comes from Judaism, from Buddhism, from Christianity, obviously, and in all the great religions of the world. But my atheist friends also care for their neighbor as well. So it seems to be a human principle. Don't just think about yourself. Get over your ego.
Where can we find your research? Where can we find your things? Any of your articles? Where would you like us to kind of funnel our viewers?
Well, I blog for Forbes, so just it's Karl Moore with a K, MWRE at Forbes, and then at my radio show, the CO series. So it's on iTunes, and it's all sorts of it's a radio show in Montreal and Ottawa on radio stations, but it's also on iTunes and things like that.
Okay, awesome.
Called the CEO series.